So for the last several years, the Sony 14mm and the Sony 20mm f1.8 lenses have been the undisputed kings of astrophotography. But last week, Sony came out with the new 16mm f1.8G, and I said that I really liked it. It was probably going to be my go-to lens, and for some reason, that made a lot of people really upset. So I'm here on my 1 day off of a month-long assignment in the Norwegian Arctic, not relaxing, but instead filming a YouTube video to bring you the ultimate Sony Astro lens wide-angle prime landscape showdown extravaganza shootout jamboree. That's not really the best name, but it's a working title. Let's get into it. Okay, just as a quick side note, I do want to mention that just because one lens is great doesn't mean that all of the older lenses are now bad. There can be more than one good lens at a time, and just because there's a new exciting lens does not mean that you have to buy it. Now that said, if you are gonna buy every single new lens, please use my affiliate links below. Okay, that was an incredible day to be testing these lenses. I got just the perfect weather from beautiful sunlight all the way through northern lights and astrophotography. I honestly, not to spoil the surprise, but I loved all three of these lenses. I'm back in the studio now. Let's dive into this and look at these photos and see if one of these really stands out as the ultimate wide-angle prime lens from Sony. Okay, this is one of my favorite views in Norway. I just absolutely love this mountain here in the middle. It's just beautiful. I shot all of these on the 14, then the 16, and then the 20. I did the exact same settings for all three lenses, so there's no variation, like was my ISO too high, was it a different f-stop? If one of the photos is darker, that's an issue with that lens having less light transmission because I did the same shutter speed even. So looking at this, let's just thumb through them real quick so you can see them. 14mm, here's the 20mm, and here's the 16mm. For some reason, Lightroom is not putting these in order for me. I'm sorry about that. I'll just go through like this, ready? So widest to tightest, there's 14, there's 16, there's 20. I would say just right off the bat, the 16 looks like it has the best light transmission. The 14 looks overall darker, looking at the histogram up there in the right. It looks like the 14 is by far the darkest histogram. Now that could be a function of it's just way wider. I would also say though, it has a serious vignette. I mean, it's to be expected at 14mm, but you can just see there's a pretty crazy vignette on this lens, wide open at f1.8. The 16mm has way less vignette, and that could right there be the reason that it's a brighter image overall. The 20 also, honestly, I see vignette. It's not as bad as the 14, but it's definitely there, and this is a slightly darker image. Now, if we zoom in on the highlights, I would say all three of these look to be pretty similarly exposed. So I think it's pretty much a function of the vignette. Like, to me, that tells me that the light transmission is about the same in the center of the frame for all three lenses. These highlights look really similar to me in terms of how much light is actually coming through in the center of the frame. Also sharpness. Obviously the 20 is gonna look like it's rendering more detail here because it's a tighter lens, so you're not technically cropping in as far. But all three of these are extremely sharp in the center of the frame, to my mind. I mean, when you look, like we are, we are way zoomed in there. Down in the corners, the 14mm, as I said in my original 16mm review, is rectilinear. You're going to get pixel stretching. You basically get to choose, do you get straight lines, like straight horizons, etc., or do you have no distortion or no pixel stretching at all? This one's rectilinear, so straight horizons, but then, of course, objects at the edges of the frame look a little bit stretched. Just looking at that seaweed there, this looks a little gunkier, like a little bit less clean. Here, this is the exact one. So if the 14mm, you can see this piece of seaweed. This is in the shade, but it looks like there's maybe some fringing or like sort of a halo around it. And then again on the 16, that same piece of seaweed, looks about the same as the 20 to me. Like there's a little bit of a, you know, it's just not quite as crisp on the edges here versus the 14. I don't see any of that like halo or anything around the objects themselves. You know, we're shooting wide open. These are close to the frame, so they're kind of bokeh out. They're at the very edges of a very wide angle prime. It's only going to get so good, but to me, I feel like all three of these lenses look good. I feel like if I'm going to declare a winner here, it's being ridiculously nitpicky for something that 99.9% of us will never actually need to implement. Let's go to a slightly different scenario. So here I'm putting the lenses through their paces at different apertures. This is important. I was talking about that vignette on the 14mm. So I shot this scene, exact same settings for all three lenses. I took one photo at f1.8 and another photo at f5.6. So the 14mm here at f1.8 and then 5.6. You can see when I go back and forth between the two that the vignette does disappear. It's not startling how much vignette there is, but it would be a lie to say that there's none. Sharpness, to me, looks great for both of them. I don't feel like there's a need to get super picky here. All right, let's look at the same part of the frame, the edges. Yeah, I would say the 5.6 is maybe a little bit sharper at the edges, but still, that's great. That's fantastic performance in my opinion. Now the 20mm, this is at f1.8, 5.6. That to me is a noticeable vignette difference. It looks like at f1.8, actually, there's more light transmission in the middle of the frame than at 5.6. I might have just slightly underexposed. I might not have like gotten the exact same even exposure between the two, but looking at the edges of the frame, going back and forth between the two, it's a noticeable difference. And then now for the 16mm, here is f1.8 and f5.6. I genuinely can't see a difference between those. That's pretty incredible. That's like zero vignette at f1.8, which to me for a 16mm lens is kind of astonishing. So I feel for this one, that's a no-brainer. The 16mm absolutely wins. I think the 14mm maybe is in second place, and the 20mm is in third place for vignette while shooting wide open. This is one of those things only you can decide if that's something that you care about. I'm declaring the 16mm lens the winner in terms of it has the least vignette. You might not think that's actually good. I personally like vignette in my photos. I mentioned this in my original 20mm review that I did 5 years ago when it came out. I really like vignette in photos. I will actually add vignette to photos because it helps with subject isolation. I don't always do like literally the vignette slider. You know, sometimes it'll be brushes or gradients, etc. But I don't necessarily think that's bad. But if you're looking for the most clinically clean lens in terms of vignette, the 16mm seems to be by far the best out of these options. All right, let's get into the interesting stuff here. Let's do Astro, huh? So for Astro photography, these are fully unedited images. Obviously they're gonna look better with some editing if I, you know, brighten them up a little bit, give it some exposure, adjust my white balance. They're gonna look like better images overall, but these are just raw, straight out of camera because I think it's important to look at the character of the lenses themselves. So starting with the 14, let's look at this really bright star right off the bat. That's kind of a funky way that is rendered here, and I think it's worth noting. There's no obstruction in front of it. It's just that very bright light source is being rendered with sort of an hourglass shape in the middle. Kind of interesting. That's not something you're gonna deal with too much. Center of the frame, the stars, of course, are exceptionally sharp. The 14mm is a G Master lens, and it's one of the best of all time. But up in the corners, that's where you're really gonna find out how much you like a lens. I am seeing a little bit, I mean, gosh, a tiny bit of
astigmatism. It could be coma also. Hard to tell if there's a little bit of that comet tail stretching. That's a telltale sign. Again, I'm zoomed in to what I would consider an outrageous amount. This is like true pixel peeping. This lens looks great. There's no way around it. This is optically a very, very good lens for astrophotography. Now let's go to the 20, it's next. Again, in the center, this is kind of rendering similarly, but less so, which I think is interesting. These stars in the center look very sharp also. Maybe slightly less sharp than the 14, but we're really getting picky there. And then up in the corners, again, a lot of vignette that's visible. And I would say this is significantly worse optically than the 14 millimeter, but I still think it's beautiful. You can see that each one of these stars has what kind of looks like Saturn's rings around it. And that's an optical aberration. That's not what you want. You wouldn't call that a perfectly clean lens. We're zoomed in very far here. When I zoom out, you can see like this is very pixel peepy, but it's not perfect. It's really not. Let's look at the other side here. Well, I guess, first of all, right in the center towards the top, still a little bit of that going on where the stars are stretched. And then again in the corner, really, really significant astigmatism and a little bit of coma on these as well. So great, love this lens. It's my absolute go-to astrophotography lens, but the 14 millimeter is overall cleaner and better for astrophotography. Now the 16 millimeter, the one that I said I loved for astrophotography and inexplicably made a lot of people angry, let's peep it. So center looks magnificent as always. This star, similar kind of an hourglass shape to it. So maybe that star is just being weird that night. Maybe that's not a lens thing. I don't know. I only took photos with these 3 lenses, so I have nothing to really compare it to. Center looks amazing. Now, the part we've all been waiting for, these corners. It looks about the same as the 20 to me. It's not optically perfect. I don't think it's as good as the 14, but I do think it's as good as the 20. Let's just go back and forth between the two. Like, if I covered up which lens was which over here, if I removed that, I'm not sure anybody would be able to tell me which one's which. 16, 20. Let's put the 14 in there too. Let's really compare them. 16, 20, 14. They're really, really comparable. There's just no way around it. They really are. Let's look at a different setup. This is just kind of an interesting shot because we have the moon in the frame, so it's a very, very bright light source, and the mountains are a little bit more illuminated, so it's just kind of an interesting way to look at it. Again, very sharp in the center, as expected. Corners look about the same. For the 14, let's see here. Center, very sharp. Stars look good. The moon is rendered beautifully, I think. And the corners look about as expected. Again, not flawless, but that's ridiculously good for a 14 millimeter lens. Like, that's a very wide lens, no matter how you cut it. And that's incredible image rendering. And the 20, similar thing. Let's look. Sharp in the center, not surprised. The moon looks excellent. And then up in the corners again. Boy, those stars just literally look like Saturn. Look at this son of a gun here. Wow. That's not great, to be honest with you. It's really the brighter stars show it more, obviously. These smaller stars look magnificent, but the really bright ones are showing some pretty significant aberration there. And this isn't good. This is pretty far from the center, or from the corner, and still showing some some aberration. Okay, last Astro photo we're gonna look at. They're all sort of similar. This one's just kind of interesting because the moon now is behind us instead of in frame. There's a little more depth of field with this foreground in the mountains and less aurora, so we can really look at the stars themselves. So starting with the 14 in the center of the frame, this is all very sharp. These kind of look like they're glowing a little bit. There could have been some haze, but they still have like a rectangular shape to the lights, which tells me that we're resolving down to the single pixel resolution of our sensor. So the lens is out resolving the sensor in my camera, and that's what we want. Moving to the edges of the frame, similar thing, these lights on the horizon, those are like lighthouse buoy kind of things, look good. The mountains look great. Down here in the foreground, this looks amazing. We're getting a little rectilinear pixel stretching as expected. It's hard to say if these fence posts are tilted because of the lens's rectilinear correction or if they are just tilty fence posts. Pretty likely. Again, stars up in the corner. This is probably the worst the 14 has looked out of all three of these photos we've looked at so far, but I can forgive it. There's a little bit of haze up here, and so there's a chance that these stars glowing through gentle or like thin clouds is exacerbating the optical abnormalities of these lenses. And I do think that's the case here, but maybe -5 points from the 14 millimeter for that. It's the first chink in the armor we've seen. Honestly, this lens is ridiculously good. Let's move on to the 20, kind of a similar thing here. Looks great in the center. These are resolving again, just about exactly the same. These mountains look pretty good. It's not nearly as wide, so we get much less foreground to deal with. Big surprise, 20 millimeters, not as wide as 14. Not exactly groundbreaking news, but incredible sharpness and detail down in the corners of the foreground, and then the stars look actually better than the 14. Let's go back. Yeah, I think the 20 might be beating the 14 here. That looks pretty good. There's still obviously some aberrations there, but I'm happy with it overall. And then the 16, same thing, looks great. It's sharp in the center. I'm still seeing that rectangular light resolution, so it still is out resolving the resolution of my sensor, which is all I could ever ask for. Now, you will notice some here. Let's just go from the 14 to the 16. You will notice some pretty significant distortion. So the 16 is supposed to be rectilinear also. This horizon is perfectly flat with the 14, and it curves up on the edges and down towards the center a little bit with the 16. That is by far the biggest optical flaw of the 16. It is a little bit disappointing, but it's easy to correct for, and it's not a huge deal to me. I don't really hate it. It's just like 5% fisheye on a lens that is 95% rectilinear. It'll be very easy to fix, but honestly, like these lenses all look so similar optically in terms of chromatic aberration, coma, astigmatism, etc., that you kind of have to nitpick. So far, the 16 millimeter has a significant advantage in terms of less vignette, but then a disadvantage in terms of a little bit of barrel distortion through the middle of the frame, causing those horizons to be bowed. There you have it. I did shoot to really test that out. I shot some stuff, it's a boring photo, but I just wanted to see how straight these lines are. There's the 14 millimeter, and then here's the 16 millimeter. So going back and forth, you can see what I'm talking about with that distortion. It is what it is. I focused on the railing and then on the background to see if that impacted it. It doesn't. You can see it's a great example of this lens having zero focus breathing, which is really cool. The 14 millimeter, similar. No distortion focused on either the foreground or the background, but you can see there is focus breathing. The image looks like it zooms in and out a little bit when I toggle between those. Whereas the 16 millimeter doesn't do that really at all. It just, it has that distortion. And then the 20 millimeter, similar concept. There's definitely focus breathing here. You can see, if you look at this mountain on the right side of the frame, when I change the zoom, it visibly looks like it zooms in and out. But the important part is there's no distortion here. This is a very clean lens in terms of the straightness of these lines, which is what I was testing for. I tested the focus breathing a little bit more dramatically by putting a mug in the foreground so that we had more depth of field to focus breathe. And you can see the 20 millimeter really does zoom in and out, like to the point where it maybe goes from like a 20 millimeter to a 22 millimeter when you change your focus. It's like pretty dramatic, beautiful bokeh rendering. That is what it is. The 16 millimeter, you can see that distortion definitely is real. There's no way around it. But the focus breathing is pretty much non-existent. I'm looking at like this cabin back here, and it's so hard to see with, with the bokeh, but it doesn't look like it moves at all. Like this tree branch and this window are on the edge of frame, and when I go to the blurred out one, they continue to be right on the edge of frame, which is pretty incredible. And then the 14 millimeter, same story as the 20, in my opinion. There is definitely focus breathing. So that pretty much covers it. In summary, 16 millimeter, zero vignette, zero focus breathing, optically nearly flawless corner to corner, but pretty wild distortion. Not wild, it has some distortion. It's not, to me, the end of the world. Artistically, this is a decision only you can make if that ruins your life. For me, I'm fine with it. I'm gonna use it to stitch dramatic, wide astrophotography panoramas. I can optically correct it in my computer very, very easily, or even in camera very easily. Not a huge deal. 20 millimeter, a lot of vignette, a lot of focus breathing. Optically, very good, but probably in third place out of all three of these lenses. And then the 14 millimeter, I would have to give it the #1 spot here. It has quite a bit of vignette, but it's 14 millimeters at f1.8. That's to be expected. But optically in the corners, the stars looked the best out of all three lenses, in my opinion. There's a little bit of focus breathing, but not a ton. But for me, as I mentioned, the astrophotography is the goal for all three of these. And I think the 14, then the 16, then the 20 would be my choices in that order. I would love to hear what you think. If you've used all three of these lenses, I would love to hear what your preferences are, or even just from watching my video. If you feel like there's a clear winner, please tell me in the comments below. This is the internet, someone's probably gonna call me a terrible name, but I'd still love to hear what you think. Leave a comment down below. In the meantime, click like, subscribe, write a letter to your congressman, and tell all your friends. My name's Nate in the Wild. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.